So,
Augustine,
welcome. Yes.
can I ask a quick question? I see all these faces across the bottom of my screen, and it would be so useful for me to just know who is a mama and who is a midwife. I know we don't
Yeah,
have time for all. We're going to do that later.
do introductions.
Thank
That's what
you.
we're starting with. So you're
Super.
perfect. Can I ask you to go first, Lisa? Will you tell us a
Okay,
little
I
bit
got
about who
myself
you
into
are?
trouble.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm a teacher, so I always think of these things. My name is Lisa Heineman, and I am the mother of a stillborn child whose name was Thor, who was born in November of 2008. I also have a 25-year-old and a 6-year-old who was an adopted child who came along afterwards. And I had a miscarriage along the way as well, which I'm willing to talk about. I ended up writing a book about my experience called Ghost Belly. So a lot of my thinking sort of came out in that form as well.
And it's such a tremendous resource for mamas and midwives. If you haven't seen her book, I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
It's a really beautiful memoir. It's engaging. You can't put it down. And it's so well done. I really thank you for that gift to the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and tell me, when was the date of your son's birth and death?
November 12th, 2008.
Right. Okay. So a lot of processing since then. We look forward to your insights here as we go. Kia, you're on the call. Can I ask you to share about who you are and where you're calling from?
Sure. My name is Kelly E. Parker, and I'm calling from Honolulu, Hawaii. And I am a mother of a stillborn. My daughter was born September 14th. 2016.
Right. And you're in Hawaii.
Yeah. I'm in Hawaii.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Well, I know that Jennifer is on the call. Is that right, Jennifer?
I am. Is it working for the sound?
Perfect.
Yay.
Yes.
I just signed on my phone, so I'm glad it worked out.
Perfect. I'm so glad. Will you tell us about who you are and where you're calling from?
Well, I am Jennifer again, and I am from Roseburg, Oregon, and my son was born July 13th of 2012, and he did live 2 days and then pass away on July 15th of 2012.
Thank you.
So it wasn't, it was perinatal loss.
Yeah, and just to make a clarification before we go too much further, the conversation in the whole birth community sometimes misses the mark in terms of describing the event. And so we use stillbirth because it's the most commonly understood generic term, if you will, for this situation. But actually, we're talking about perinatal loss, and that is loss of a baby before the birth, in the third trimester, during the labor delivery, or in the immediate postpartum period. And perinatal loss is actually defined as in the first 28 days. So obviously, all of those experiences create a significant challenge emotionally, personally, professionally, every possible way. And so today what we are mainly focusing on is the emotional, spiritual, mental, physical experience and recovery during perinatal loss, not just about the actual birth process. So thanks for adding that. I appreciate that. So I'd just like to kind of open the floor to the moms. And my first question for you would be basically, what did you do brilliantly? And that might seem like an odd place to come from, but I look at all experiences as the part of us that is becoming whole again when we go through big ordeals. And so in reflecting on your experience, and all of you are at least a year out from your experience, I wonder what you did brilliantly before, during, or after the experience.
Since I'm already on, right?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. So I guess I can say a few things that I thought that I did pretty well. I mean, in the whole scheme of things, you never exactly know what you're doing well then, but I think now that I've had a little bit of time to process it, I can tend to go back. And I feel like I did a really good job at just kind of taking everything one day at a time and not trying to take on too much at one time, as far as like processing the grief or dealing with my emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also really did well leaning on my spouse instead of kind of any sort of, not that he had any reason I could blame him, but instead of blaming him or because he's somebody I trust, I feel like I did really well at like just like processing it with him and not, I don't know, just not getting ahead of myself and not just trying to like not let it take over, but also not pretend like it didn't happen or not ignore what really did happen.
Right. And did you see, or how did you see your relationship change through your experience?
Well, I mean, we absolutely bonded a lot, and our circumstances are a little different, and I guess I can go a little bit in the backstory without going too much. But my husband, I'm his second marriage, and in his first marriage, they actually lost a baby shortly after birth, but with completely different circumstances. And so with their circumstances, they actually knew at about the 20-week ultrasound that they would lose their son. So he had gone through this before, which is kind of a unique situation because I know a lot of people that have had a loss like this haven't had to deal with it twice. So my husband, being that he had been through it, it was different processing for us, but he was amazing. He was a total rock. So, and maybe that's because he had been through it, but our relationship's absolutely a lot stronger, and we've learned like when there is a problem just to kind of come to each other and hug it out or whatever.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Kia, tell us about what you think you did brilliantly before, during, or after your experience.
I can't say what I did, if it was brilliant. A lot of people have come to me and told me that my ability to share so openly about Honora and her loss has helped them process grief and help them acknowledge loss in their own lives. So I guess that's the way I've just refused to hide it. I talk about her. I make sure she's mentioned. We just celebrated her 1-year anniversary on September 14th, and we had a really big celebration. And it was a joyful celebration, but I didn't hide my grief. I didn't hold back on that, and I talk about her as much as I can. And I guess in light with the other mama said, Jennifer, I agree. I also didn't go down what I was calling the rabbit hole of grief, of going to that dark, deep hole where you just lose it. And so I'm thankful I didn't go there. Sometimes I really wanted to go there, and I didn't. And so if just being able to not lose it all the time and hold on to my grief and process it differently helped me to hold on to make sense of her loss. I also turned to my culture a lot. Luckily, in the Hawaiian culture, there is a lot about stillbirth in our legends and our stories, and so that helped me a lot make sense of the whole thing.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. Lisa, can I come to you now? Will you share with us what you did brilliantly?
Yeah, it's so much of what both Jennifer and Kalea have said really resonates with me. I think for me it was really important to be able to really live my grief fully and really just be 100% there and not try to rush it. Somewhere along the way, I think I read something that said that the super intense phase of grief can last about 18 months. And that's what I experienced. I was deep in it for 18 months. It wasn't a rabbit hole. I mean, I was still doing my job. I was raising my other kid. But it was clear that this was my emotional world for that. That's how long it took. So I think it's really incredibly important to to recognize that, and for me to just have that be upfront and to be talking about it was really important. In really specific terms, I think the two things that worked brilliantly for me, one was that I basically made the decision to take my child home with me. It was a home birth, but I ended up, of course, in the hospital. And then Thor was transferred to a funeral home, and then it was a funeral director who said, you can take him home, right? I had no idea. And then I ended up taking him home, and I spent time, I basically came to the funeral home every day, and I rocked him, and I read to him, and I drank tea while he was on my lap. And I took him home for 2 overnight stays. So I was very present with his body. And that was really important for me. That made him kind of real. One weird thing about stillbirth is that it's absolutely a loss, but it's kind of hard to know what this being is. Is it a loss of a potential, or is it loss of a person who's actually there? It's just really hard to deal with that. So for me, spending a lot of time with his body made a big difference. And that was a big cultural issue. It's not something that many cultures tend to do. But as I talked about this more and more, I learned from people who said, oh, yeah, where I come from, of course, somebody dies. You have them in their body in the home, and you spend time with the body. And the other thing that I think worked really brilliantly for me was writing. And it's not that I would have predicted that. Like, I'm not a creative writer. It's not that I would have said, oh, I've never even been a journaler, but so it's not like, oh, when I'm having a hard time, I keep a journal. But something like broke in my neurons, something broke apart that made me want to write. And I just went with it. And I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And that enabled me to kind of dig really deep, but in a way that wasn't circular. There was like really moving through the grief rather than just kind of sinking into it and staying in one place. And it just gave me room to grow with it, to make it into a process that felt weirdly rewarding. Like I was discovering this whole part of me that just like Jennifer says, in some ways your relationships can really change. In some ways they deepen. I discovered this part of me I didn't know I had, which was writing. And I didn't slap it down. I went with it. And for me, that really mattered a lot.
Wow. I was very moved by that time reading your book. And I have a unique experience with stillbirth or perinatal loss, is that I'm a sibling of a perinatal loss. My little brother died at 3 days old with lung immaturity and lack of the technology that we have now in 1982. I remember wanting to hold him so much that even when we were at the viewing at the funeral home, my father actually lifted him out of the casket for me to hold. And it's that same thing of it becoming real. Babies before they're born are so much about theory and possibility and dreams and hopes, and they're not concrete in any way. And so I resonated so much reading that part of your book about how obviously physically and emotionally grounding that would be in the midst of such loss.
I think for me, so that's something that midwives can really play. I'm sure we're going to talk about this later, but for me, midwives are so much about that very real experience and real grounding, and the fact that birth does involve blood, and it involves pain, and death involves pain, it involves blood, and that sense of not trying to be sanitary about it, but dealing with the messy physicality and the messy emotions. I think that's really a big part of it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'd like to kind of move the conversation right where it's going with that good segue you just made, Lisa, and kind of ask the mamas from your perspective and experience, what really worked from your providers and from your community, but specifically because today's call is about midwives. What really helped, and what really didn't help? And I encourage you to be really truthful if you can, if you want to be, because this is how we learn. So, you know, what really worked and what didn't for you, Mama?
So for me, I mean, there was a lot of things that I thought worked really well, and I'm not even sure what I think didn't. I think that as far as like help, I feel like the midwives, you and your associates did really, really good job at connecting me with really good resources. So I remember being, I don't know, a few days past and having somebody reach out to me and talk to me about a local in the Southern Oregon area, a place called Winter Spring, and talking to us about how when I was ready for it, that when I was ready for it, it would be a good resource to reach out to. So I think connecting me with really good resources. And then I know also it seems like a silly thing, but you set up a meal train for me, which was like so much more wonderful than I thought it would be. It was, you know, in the middle of the grief when you're processing, having somebody drop off a nutritious, good meal was like, it was just, I mean, I could never put a value on it. It was amazing. And you guys just really you were there for me. I personally connected more with you, being that Augustine wasn't my midwife. One of the other midwives in her practice was, but when my son passed away, she certainly, being that she has a similar story with her brother, as well as she was able to connect with me on a level that I'm not sure if I would have been able to let anybody else in. And I feel like you did a really good job about giving me some space, but always checking back in. And I feel like sometimes in grief, when people come in and try to help you, if you're not ready, you just kind of shut them off and then they never come back. And I really always appreciated the fact that you always checked back in with me. I mean, even like years down the road, you checked back on with me. How are you doing? And like on days that I connected with, his birthday, the day he passed away, there was always, you know, messages or calls or from both you, Augustine, and then my midwife. And having just somebody connecting back and forth with me and just letting me know that, you know, even though they're not in the exact same moment with me, they're processing it as well, and they're there with me as well. It was amazing. So the only thing that I mean, I'm not even sure if I would say that I know that if I wanted it done differently, but now that I have had 2 babies since Jude, and when I have had them now and had breastfeeding experiences, I sort of look back now and wonder if I would have possibly wanted to do something differently with regards to with pumping and things like that. I know that I had a lot of personal I don't know, angst or whatnot about the fact that I wasn't able to breastfeed my baby. Well, that I was, and then as soon as my milk came in, he passed away. So I know that having that milk there was a constant reminder, and I think that's, is it mine that has the feedback?
No, it's mine.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I know that having the reminder of the milk was something that I feel like everybody probably thought I would have processed better with not doing any sort of pumping or anything. I kind of sometimes wish I would have at least had a little bit more information, maybe given about these are the ways what you can do. If you chose to, you can pump and maybe donate it to others. In subsequent babies, I've actually pumped and donated like gallons and gallons of milk to people. So I kind of wonder in some ways if maybe I would have been able to like process that part of it a little bit better, like that was something he was able to give. But honestly, I also kind of feel like you did the right thing, because it was a way for me to like move forward with like once the milk had ended, then finally begin that process. So I'm not sure if I think that you should have done it differently or not. That's one thing, maybe some more information about would have been helpful. Augustine, you're on mute if you're talking.
Thank you. Loud dog. I was wondering, while we still have you up, Jennifer, if you would comment on like the next and other phases or providers that were a part, because I remember hearing that you had a lot of struggle with the medical examiner and the,
Oh my
like
gosh.
the follow-up in your case. And I wonder if you would just give a few highlights for the midwives who are listening about like what worked and what didn't in relation to that level of care provider.
Well, I don't know. I had a pretty frustrating process. My son passed away, I mentioned, in July. And so it was mid-July, July 15th when he passed away. And we did the autopsy, and through the process, they basically kept saying that they would get the information back to us, and then they weren't. And they weren't following up, and they'd say, okay, it'll be 3 weeks. So we'd wait 3 weeks. And then when we'd check back, they'd say, oh, well, it might be this. And then we would say, I don't know. So maybe, I think that honestly, our situation is not the norm from what I understand from other friends and family that have been through losses since. I kind of wonder if maybe in our situation, they lost some of the material, because when the examiner came back and finally gave me an answer with regards to what the cause of death was, he was very, he didn't actually give me an answer back until I said that I got a perinatologist involved, because we wanted to talk about the potential to have more babies, and we wanted to see if there was anything genetic. And basically when the threat of somebody else being involved in the case came forward, and my perinatologist started to look for the samples and try to figure out what had been tested for and what hadn't, he came back with nothing. He couldn't find any information. And so then finally the examiner, in a very rude way, I mean, he said to me multiple things like, babies die every day, you can't expect me to get these answers to you. He said really hurtful things. So I was not prepared for that. Honestly, I was prepared for him to have a little bit more grace, but since he didn't, I don't honestly know how a medical provider could help anymore with that process. I know that I personally was really glad that I did save the placenta, because after the fact, when things weren't adding up, I mentioned to the medical examiner that I did save the placenta and it had been in the freezer. And he said, oh, I would need that then. And so he did bring that in and do some additional testing on it. So I think that's something that maybe probably is overlooked in the fact that they can do additional testing if needed on the placenta. So in our circumstance, we had thought about maybe planting a tree with it since Jude had passed away. And so when we had to give it up to the medical examiner, it was just kind of part of the process. But I'm not sure if that's helping or not. So I don't want to continue to go down that rabbit hole unless you have a specific question, I guess.
No, that was helpful. Thanks. Kia, would you go through and tell us a little bit about what worked and what didn't with the care providers, both home and hospital, that you interfaced with?
Okay. My story is, yeah. So I honestly, I had planned a home birth with my midwife. Her name was Medra, and she had opened her home to me to have my home birth at her home. I live a few blocks away from her. She, her and I had a beautiful relationship. She was very, our prenatal visits were really good. But at the same time, I was still seeing an OB at Poly Women's Center at Castle. And I knew I was going to get this reaction, but when I explained to them I wanted a home birth, they were very, very offended and they basically cut their service with me. They told me I couldn't continue to have them as my OB if I was going to continue the route of a home birth. So I felt at that point I wouldn't have enough, I didn't know where else to go. So I just continued only to see my midwife. And I had known my midwife for a really long time and actually had trained under her to possibly become a midwife one day as well. And I had been training under her for 2 years, so I completely trusted her. And when I did go into labor, there were many signs that baby had passed away that she didn't catch, including when my water broke. It was very dark and lumpy. She used a broken fetoscope to check for baby's heart tone when I was laboring at her home. So all of these things, it didn't cause baby's passing. Baby just passed away. Honora, we think it was a cord accident. We're not quite sure. The autopsy was inconclusive. I ended up getting rushed to Castle, where I had to encounter the OBs that already had a very negative look on home birthing. In Hawaii, it's very divided. There's a lot of fear on both sides given to mothers, and so when I was at Castle, there was a lot of I was not treated very well. The woman who did deliver, who helped, well, I delivered Honora, but who was there, she in my care afterwards kept blaming babies passing on a home birth. So what had happened actually is that from my understanding is, Honora herself told her story. She had over 80% maturation. I think she passed away on a Saturday. Okay, so to kind of go back, a little backstory. My midwife was concerned about baby's positioning. She was face up. And so she had asked me to get an ultrasound. And I work at a medical clinic, and there's a really good OB that works here. So I reached out to her, and I was able to do a non-stress test and get an ultrasound done prior to this happening. And that ultrasound happened on a Friday. By Monday night, when I went into labor, my water broke and it was dark brown and lumpy, that I had a feeling Honora had passed away maybe a Saturday or Sunday. So and then when I got rushed to the hospital, when my midwife did end up transporting me because my labor wasn't processing normal, and she didn't think I could actually give birth to Honora face up. And I knew that she was face up because I had terrible back pain while laboring. But it was at the hospital that I found out she had passed away. I had not known the entire time laboring at my midwife's house. And as a result, I also got very sick because I had been laboring there for about 7 hours, 8 hours. And I had developed chorioamniocentesis. And so I was hospitalized for a week after that. And the care and the subsequent things that happened after, I ended up getting a terrible yeast infection from because I had to go on such strong antibiotics because of the infection. It made the recovery a nightmare, I guess you could say. And the care from the hospital was also very not supportive. What was very supportive, what did work, was my doula, who I had with me at Metro's house and also came with me to the hospital. She saw me every day that week. She brought me homeopathic medicine to help with the infection. I could reach out to her anytime I had questions. Unfortunately, my relationship with my midwife's no longer, I no longer have a relationship. There was, as I have so much aloha for this woman, but there was just, she didn't want to admit that she didn't know baby had passed. The entire time I was laboring, she told me that baby was strong when she transported me, all of these things. So there was so much confusion when I did get to the hospital. I was told there was no heartbeat. I thought baby had died between her house and the hospital, and there was just a lot of confusion that made it worse. Yeah.
And what finally cleared it up, the knowledge that she had been gone for a while, what information was clear to you? The maturation of her skin, was she fairly
Yeah.
macerated?
She was over 80% of her body was in maturation, and also when my water broke, the dark brown lumpy, I won't forget that. As you know, someone told me, well, if she must have, when she went into distress, that the meconium usually is black, but I guess in that time that she was inside turned brown. The level of infection, I think, also had something that she had passed away days, I think at least a day. And I also didn't feel her move, and I didn't know any better. I also maybe didn't want to acknowledge that this happened, but she felt really heavy Sunday and Monday. It was Monday night I went into labor. So in the timeline, in recollection, when I look back, I recall that I didn't feel her move for at least those 2 days.
Yeah, that's thanks for sharing that. There is such a hush hush about this topic that, in fact, we as providers and amongst the mamas talking, we aren't always clear about real reasons to call your midwife right away. And certainly that heavy sensation, the lack of movement, those are things that are real and important to pay attention to. There's a method for doing kick counts that's been a part of midwifery for years and years. And sometimes it's really, poo-pooed, like, oh, that's a waste of time. And I would say, well, yes, if you feel the baby move multiple times every hour, it is a waste of time to do. But if you don't, it's a really, really good home assessment that mom can do to find out how baby's doing, because we should have 10 movements in an hour, especially with a little bit of sugar. So, thanks for bringing that up, because that's something that we can do better, is to better educate moms about how to be empowered to check in on their baby's health.
Mm-hmm. I had reached out to another doula that I had flown in from another island to be there for my birth, and she had waited a whole week. I was 41 weeks when I lost Honora, so we were waiting, and I was just praying. We were waiting for her to come, and I had asked for a prenatal, and at that time it was the response was not. It was like, oh, if you think you need one, and I just sort of went, oh, okay, maybe I don't need one.
Right.
Yeah, I should have been a little bit more forthright, I think.
Well, we can only know what we know.
Yeah.
And so there's
now
now you are prepared in a way that you couldn't have been before, right? So so this is just a lesson for us midwives, and remembering to empower the mom with the knowledge that helps her assess her own baby's health. Lisa, will you weigh in on your experience of the medical providers and the midwives that were a part of your birth? What worked, what didn't?
Yeah. I mean, I so sympathize with these stories, and parts of them sound so familiar to me. On the subject of sort of empowering moms to, sort of say, hey, I'm worried, or I'd like to have this taken a look at. I think it's really hard, right? Because we're in this world where, heightening anxiety about what could go wrong, we connect that with kind of to interventionist practices. So we have a tendency to want to sort of pull back and say, it's not, and to say, basically sort of say, give messages that say, dangers are overblown. This is a normal process. And I think that can then translate into not communicating some important things. In my case, one thing specific along that line is, when I was in labor, my midwife basically said, when the I forget exactly what it was. It was a while ago now. But, I went into first stage labor and I was at home with my partner and it was all very comfortable. And basically she was coming from another birth, it turned out, said when the when the contractions get to be less than a minute apart, you should call me. Well, in hindsight, I can see that, we were like with a clock, waiting for the contractions to get to be less than 1 minute apart at a time where, in hindsight, I was clearly in second stage labor. I just was. And they were more than a minute apart, but I know the difference between mild contractions and strong contractions. And my midwife, having heard, so I delayed calling, even when there was blood. Once there was blood, I still waited a couple more contractions because I was like, well, I guess birth involves blood. And then at some point I was like, there's blood. This is not good. So I told my partner to please call the midwife. And, and then when she heard about this, she said, one of the things she said afterwards is, okay, my instructions now are, if anything seems, if you're having pain, call me, right? So I think that was really important, but that was kind of a technical thing. What I really experienced was something that is really familiar to me from what you described, Kelly, having to do with kind of being caught between a rock and a hard place, right? I'd started out with the hospital, with the midwives at the hospital, made a decision for a home birth. Home birth is very contested in Iowa, which is where I live. I actually ended up working with the only certified nurse midwife who was doing home births in the entire state of Iowa, who lived 2 blocks away from me, which was wonderful. And she'd been practicing for 20 years. She was very, very experienced and had done hundreds of deliveries with no bad outcomes. But nevertheless, there was a real tension in the air with the hospital. But then the flip side of that was that when the stillbirth did occur, when Thor died, there was discomfort with the midwives community. And I think, I actually think that my midwife behaved very, very professionally. She came to the hospital, spoke to me there. After I was back home, she called to ask whether she should come by to do my postnatal checkup, and we talked, and she sort of kept checking in with me. I don't have to be here if you'd rather not be around me, but if it would be helpful to talk, I'm here. I think she behaved really, really well, really professionally and really compassionately, and gave me the option of having her help me or not. But really weirdly, one thing I discovered is that, of course, a lot of people knew I'd had the stillbirth. People knew that I was hugely pregnant. I was also post-date. But I didn't get the support from the midwives community. There's a lot of certified practical midwives in my community. And it turned out, I would have expected to be hearing from all of them, or a bunch of them. And it turned out that because of medical confidentiality, my midwife had not shared any information at all. She understood that that was for me to share. So, but of course word got around, but then the people who were certified practical midwives, CPMs in the community, they knew who the midwife had been, but she wasn't talking, and they didn't know what to do, right? So there was this immense awkwardness, and it was also very clear that my case could become a real problem to the midwives community, right? Again, this is a state in which midwifery, out-of-hospital birth, is politically very tricky. This was the one CNM practicing, and she just had a catastrophic stillbirth that was not necessary. Again, I think that in reality, everybody involved wanted to be practicing the best healthcare they could possibly provide. And they felt the greatest empathy for me and very much wanted to help. But even on my own, I was aware that I had become a problem case. So it was really hard for me, right, to know how I could talk about this with the out-of-hospital birthing community, which was my community. Again, I was kind of cut off from hospital, from the hospital birth community at that point. So that was really difficult. I mean, and like I say, I don't think anybody ever tried, no one ever tried to pressure me. Even once it was clear that I was doing writing about this, I never had any hint of saying, we hope you don't tell your story. Never had a hint of that. I think the midwives behaved beautifully, but nevertheless, I had to know. I mean, I just knew this was a problem, right? I had to write. I had no choice but to write about it. But this was going to be tricky. This was just really going to be tricky. And there were times later on where, and this was not in my immediate community, but hi, we have somebody new. When once my book was out, it was supposed to be reviewed in one of the main midwifery journals, and it was just at the same time that big new study came out. It was a study that meant trouble.
Val, I'm going to have you go ahead and mute yourself. Hey, Val.
Sorry.
I see that you're on. Val, will you mute yourself? Thanks.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead and mute yourself, and we'll come to you in just a sec.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me
No worries.
figure this out here.
So anyway, there was, I was definitely self-conscious. It was pretty tricky all around, and that had to do with, I mean, I really do blame that on the larger politics of midwifery, not anything that anybody in particular did wrong, but there it is. That's what the politics are, and it meant that I was in a pretty sticky position. In a super practical sense, one thing that I just want to put on the table is that, as you know, for me, being able to take Thor home was unbelievably important to me. I didn't learn about that possibility from the midwife. I didn't learn about that possibility from the hospital. And the people in the hospital were super compassionate. I didn't have the same reaction as Kelly did. And I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing your name wrong. They were very compassionate in the hospital, and they just kept their mouths shut about what they thought. But they were very compassionate. But I didn't find out about it from them either. It was when I went to the funeral home. The funeral director was the one who told me about that. So one thing I always say to midwives is find out what the resources are in your community. Find out whether taking the body home is legal in your state, because the laws are different from state to state. Find out whether green burial is a possibility. Find out whether home burial is a possibility. Find out what level of, whether you're in a state where the child has to go, just find out what the options are. Because if you're dealing with a mother who's chosen a midwife, you're probably dealing with a mother who might need to know about other options for burial and for grieving. And that's something midwives can prepare themselves for.
Yeah, that's it's really important research, and I'm hoping that it's one of the action items that'll come out of this of tonight's meeting is to come up with some points that need to be researched and disseminated among the midwifery community so that we are better able to serve and counsel our clients. Thank you very much for that. Well, with that, into the political arena that is the reality of home birth and midwives, let's go ahead and transition to introducing the midwives on the call tonight, because I would really love to kind of have the next level of conversation. So Krista is here as my co-facilitator tonight with the midwives. So Krista, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Krista Miracle. I'm a direct entry midwife here in Utah. I recently relocated to Utah from California. And I've had the opportunity to attend actually a number of births. Fortunately, I feel like for myself and for my community that have allowed me to witness known anomalies and non-known anomalies that would lead to either stillbirth or perinatal loss. So really it's my goal, though, to understand where mothers are coming from, how our community can build relationships, not just with the mothers, but with each other, with the other providers we're transferring to, across the board, so that in the end, the relationship and the experience that the mother has and that the family has is a long-lasting something that they can hold close to them, rather than they can walk away with and feel that they can never look back to those people. We want relationships where we can continuously provide something to this family that will help them, no matter what that is. So discovering what those things are, and then ultimately helping the midwife and helping her understand what her role is there and how she sits with her role in that situation.
Thank you for that. And it's so obviously in line with my mission here, which is why I love that you're joining me in this. Thank you. Tara, can I call on you? And as a member of the midwives panel tonight, I'm hoping that you midwives will share with us what has specifically drawn you to have this national conversation with us tonight about what's working and what's not, and what we can do to make the experience as best as it can be for the mamas and the families, but also for the midwives and within the midwifery and home birth community. And so from that place, what drew you to speak with us tonight, and why do you feel like this work is so important, and who are you and where are you calling from? So Erin, would you share that with, or I'm sorry, I started with Tara. Tara, would you start with? I was looking at Erin's name.
So I am a CPM. I just finished school and became licensed through NARM as a CPM. I went to Midwives College of Utah, and I started attending births as a birth photographer. That was a little over 10 years ago. And it was 8 years ago that I attended my best friend's birth, and I was there in the capacity of photographer. And she had a stillbirth. This was not known prior to us arriving at her birth. She was planning a home birth with out-of-hospital midwives that actually were the same group of midwives that I was seeing at the time. I was 8 months pregnant. So we were due with our babies just a few weeks apart, and spent our pregnancies really preparing together for our children to arrive, and we're really excited about this. So this was someone that was very involved in my life and very close to me. And so when we arrived and the midwives started to set everything up, it was discovered that her baby, they couldn't find heart tones. Her birth ended up unfolding pretty quickly, and she ended up giving birth at home. And can you tell, or did it disconnect?
No, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So she ended up having her baby at home, and I was able to be there and be a witness to that experience for her, to take photos of her birth, which was what my intention of being there was to do, is to photograph her birth. And so I was able to be in that space with her, and it was kind of a turning point for me looking back, that experience made me realize that I could be a midwife, and that even through some of these really hard, challenging things, that I could be present there and walk beside women and just give them support through those experiences. And it's actually a very dear, beautiful memory to me. Remembering being at her birth, I remember going in her daughter's room after she was born. The midwife asked me to go find a blanket and a hat for her, and I just remember going in there in the nursery that I'd helped her paint, choosing now what I was going to bring to wrap her baby in. And I was able to go home and get stuff to make do footprints for her and handprints that night, and came back the next day and went and got a hand and foot mold kit to go and take molds of her daughter's hands and feet and take more photos. Her baby was born in the night, and so her kids had been asleep through the birth. And so they woke up the next morning excited because they knew that mom had been in labor the night before. So they woke up excited to see their new sister and told that that she had passed away. And so I was able to go that day and take pictures of her with her siblings and with their whole family. And I just remember sitting on the couch with her for hours that day, you know, with her being able to hold her baby. And it kind of just felt like we were both hanging out and she was just holding her baby. And so I really loved that aspect of it. Like Lisa said, having that time at home with her baby, with her body, being able to look at her and hold her and have those time, I think was really critical for my friend to have that. And it was just a challenging time, but also really a beautiful experience for me to be there with her. And then I really was involved, you know, since then a lot with her in her grief, kind of more intimately than I think most of the time we would be as midwives, because it was my best friend. And so I was able to really hear her experience and let her process with me and be able to really be intimately involved with giving support to her, which is really nice. She was a very also outspoken person about her loss and did a lot of blogging and really shared her experiences, which I think was really helpful for her and helpful for a lot of other mothers who had gone through the same things. And I just am grateful for all of the wisdom I've gained through her. I think it's made me better able to walk that path in the future if I need to as a care provider. And also this last spring, my sister lost her 8-month-old baby. So I've been kind of walking through this path of grief and loss of children with some of the closest women in my life, women that I've had in my life, and it's a hard place to sit with, but I feel like it's so important for us to be able to just be present and hear their story and hear what they have to say about that, and just be as open to sitting with the pain and sitting with the grief as we can be, and not run away from that or try to fix it.
Yeah, that is the struggle, right? It's so the opposite of what we see modeled in our culture of, you know, just moving on, shoving the feelings, not dealing with it. So thank you for bringing light to that. And thank you for joining our call. And Tara, you're calling in from Oregon, right?
Yes, I'm in Oregon City, Oregon.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Christy, would you tell us who you are and what drew you to share tonight?
Sure. I'm Christy Hins. I'm a CPM and a licensed midwife in Wisconsin. I'm a newer midwife. I passed my NARM in March, and so I've only been licensed a brief period of time. And one of my first births as a midwife ended up being a perinatal loss. Baby was born with an undiagnosed congenital heart defect and then died a few days later. And part of the reason I, wanted to join this call and talk about grief is I felt my partner and I were really able to show up for the family. However, we didn't have anybody who showed up for us, and I know that sounds kind of selfish when you know, it wasn't necessarily our loss. But I felt like we didn't have a soft place to land. And we heard the whisperings through the community, you know, like people that wouldn't really reach out to us, reaching out to us like, hey, you know, like you could just like fishing for information and not being straightforward with us, you know, just it felt really yucky, you know, like instead of our sisters coming around us and saying, hey, we've experienced it too, or I haven't experienced it, but we're here for you. I felt like for a brief time after the birth of this baby, we were kind of the targets of gossip. And that's not a community I want to practice in, you know. And since then, you know, our guild has kind of stepped up for us here in Wisconsin. The president of our guild has reached out, you know, but it wasn't a soft place to land. And, you know, I was fortunate that my partner and I work very well together, and she and I were able to do some of our own processing. But we really felt like we were floundering. So here, I felt this would be a safe space to kind of share that information, as well as hear what families need from me in the future, what my midwives need from me in the future, you know, what we all need from each other, you know, so that I can sort of do my own healing, not necessarily about the loss. The loss, I feel I've done my work. It's almost like a betrayal, like the betrayal of my community, and how can I handle, you know, that in the future?
Oh, thank you for your candor, and thank you for so carefully verbalizing that really present feeling that exists in our midwifery community right now. And I would say betrayal is a pretty good descriptor. I wrote in my blog post this week, my newsletter that went out, that it's really cold in midwifery right now. I mean, it feels like a winter wind. We have this incredible stories of hazing coming out and of discrimination. And it's really, we're at a turning point, I think, in our midwifery culture. And obviously when tensions are heightened, and there's a perception of wrongdoing, or a perception of, you know, going against the grain or not following the status quo. Those of us who have been in that situation are so ostracized in our community. And it's such the opposite of sisterhood, which is what is preached so often. And so, you know, in coming together to have this national conversation, what I hope that what we're hoping to do is to break down some of that ice and have the conversation about how we can truly support each other through this incredibly intense work. So thank you, Christy, for your introduction, and also for naming that which is so prevalent for a lot of us right now. Thank you very much. Erin, can I call on you next to share with us who you are and what's brought you to this call tonight?
Sure. I'm a new midwife. I started practicing I'm in Pennsylvania. I started attending home births. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not popping up.
Yeah, we can hear you well. Go ahead.
Okay, good. I started attending home births about 5 years ago and started practicing in March of 2016 on my own. And during my training with my last preceptor, we experienced a loss. It was not expected, and it was a perinatal loss. It was the next evening. And the autopsy was inconclusive, so we believe that it was either an undiagnosed genetic issue, or GBS, undiagnosed GBS. But it was actually my very first solo catch, and that definitely affected me a lot. So Christy, I can definitely relate to how it affects your community relationships and, just the way that you practice midwifery, the way you want to practice midwifery. And it was actually a friend, not my best friend or anything, but a friend, the client. So it took a lot to go and, be there for her and do things and have a constant reminder, even though it wasn't my loss, it was still a loss that, we experienced. And there was no support whatsoever from our community, but in Pennsylvania, we don't have much of a community, unfortunately. But it was in the natural birth community, it was definitely talked about. Unfortunately, it was talked about a lot. And because I wasn't the midwife, I don't think I received a lot of the gossip. It was more my preceptor, that was talked about more. And that's really difficult, especially when, you're trying to continue that support for the mom and dad. And fortunately, because of the situation, I can't go into too much detail, but the mom was very open to me helping them and helping them work through it. But I think that's probably the only reason why so many people in the natural birth community here realize that, it wasn't my fault, which is something that no matter what the situation is, there's a level of blame, for the midwives. And it's definitely difficult to process that. And it was 2 years ago this month. So, it's still fresh, but I think speaking with a therapist that deals with birth trauma was very, very beneficial for me. Even though it wasn't my birth, it was helpful.
Yeah. I hope when we move into conversation here in just a little bit, I hope that we can circle back to this idea of what other providers in our community can be that resource for us within the midwifery community, but also within the larger bodywork and therapy community, because I think it's vital that we get that kind of attention to the healing process. So thanks for reminding us about that. And I really want to also put a pin in that idea of blame, because that is also what I would say the thing I hear the most when I hear from midwives who've experienced this. And, in my consulting capacity and in helping midwives around the country, I get calls all the time from midwives who are experiencing not always a perinatal loss, but some kind of complication, NICU admission, transport, et cetera, and the feeling of loss that we walk around with or are concerned with, whether it's real or not, is whether it's happening or not, is still very real for those of us in the midwifery profession. So I kind of want to circle back to that blame issue too. Okay, let's see. Val, you're on the call, right? Would you share with us by unmuting yourself about what brought you to this and where you're practicing and who you are?
Sure. First wanted to say I'm so sorry that I came on late. I had a hot mess toddler. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone who took the time to be here. I feel so grateful that I can be invited into this. I have a pretty fresh fetal demise experience that just occurred August 6th of this year. So still really raw about lots of it. And I started tending births about 11 years ago, and branched out onto my own in 2015 as a licensed CPM in New Jersey, and relocated up to central Vermont just under a year ago. So I'm in a really new community, and a colleague of mine was actually out of the country when this demise happened, and I was covering her practice. So her client essentially fell into my care about 4.5, 5-ish weeks before she gave birth. And, you know, I think there'll be hopefully time and space to get into more detail, but in short, everything checked out to be fine, you know, throughout pregnancy and even in labor. It was a precipitous labor. I was there just under 40 minutes before baby came, and all vitals were reassuring. 7th baby, all home births prior, you know, everything that you would expect to be just this lovely, perfect birth. Dad really active, wanting to catch and so on. And baby was born, and upon rupture of membranes, baby came, and there was thick particulate meconium, and baby actually never did, but just wasn't able to take a breath. Yeah, so it is really, through it all, been a really incredible experience. And I don't know if this has already been touched upon, but I really feel like in my experience that the initiation that we've all essentially come to, I'm assuming all of us or most of us, in walking through death, watching a baby pass through the veil is really, as painful as it is, a gift. And I feel like I'm learning so much from this short but powerful life that I was a part of. We definitely need more support for these sort of experiences. I do feel, though, in my community, though I'm new, that I have been held, but still think that we definitely need more resources set up for midwives, who most of us probably are having these experiences and needing to jump right back into another birth. You know, yeah. And I know myself that a week later, I really probably had no business being at a birth. And I don't know if anyone can attest to this, but I certainly know that the first birth that I tended after the demise, I didn't see that baby that was pink and healthy and crying. I literally was seeing this flaccid, lifeless baby that was not going to join us earthside. And it wasn't for a really long extended period of time, but just having that awareness of like, wow, this is like deep, like human experience. We know grief and loss, and you know, we feel it like on a cellular level, and really wanting to, you know, hone in on what are the ways that we can really make, you know, recovery, you know, preserve ourselves, like, and the longevity of that, you know, how does that affect our practice? You know, I know that because it's so new, maybe I'm in some different phases, but I really love the way that I practice, and I like to be hands off, and I love when mom catches and dad catches. And you know, now for me, you know, I feel like, wow, do I need to completely, you know, shift and change the entire way that I walk beside a woman, and that we all step into the unknown together. You know, yeah, I know that I missed some other parts of this discussion, but wanted to echo, I think it was Lisa, about the bereavement, or no, I'm sorry, about holding the baby. And I think it was Tara that I wanted to touch upon really quickly about the photography, but Lisa about holding the baby. I know that I just wanted to get it out there that I don't know what the other experiences are. It was so powerful for the family to hold that baby and take that baby home with them, so that that baby could meet the other siblings, the 6 other siblings. And that baby got to be held and passed around. And that baby spent the night laying on dad's chest for the whole night, so that dad could feel the weight of that baby on him and smell that baby and touch that baby. I mean, so much healing was there. And even if we looked at it on a greater scale of like mammals, like what do mammals do in the wild? They, you know, gorillas, they hold their baby for days, right? They don't just dispose of their baby or let someone take their baby away. And then again, with really quickly echoing Tara about the importance of the photography. I mean, this family has really just gone on to say, please, if anyone experiences this, encourage them to take the photos, because we are treasuring them, and love that there's photos of us holding our baby, kissing our baby, our children holding and touching our baby. And, you know, I think in walking through this experience, unfortunately, we don't, I don't know, I don't feel like there's a lot of emphasis on that in our culture in general. And really, again, just wanting to make that known that this was extremely helpful for this family. And I don't know if anyone else, quickly before I give someone else a chance to speak, has had this. This particular family and I are obviously bonded for life through this experience, but they came from a very strong faith. And I honestly felt like there were times in the postpartum, the very early hours, that they were carrying me through this experience in just their ability to really accept death and, you know, surrender to the process. And I was so fortunate that there wasn't any blame, that really it was such, yeah, I'm like speechless about it still, that they've invited me over for dinner for their 6-week postpartum visit to share in fellowship. I mean, and I think that's a really rare experience that most midwives have. But to, I think the lesson in that is finding what that family's anchor is, I guess. If it's not religion, you know, what is the spiritual practice? You know, really knowing that family in and out and figuring out, okay, how can we really grab onto that and foster, you know, where they find their strength to move through this, and talking about it. Not that we want to emphasize it prenatally, but really realizing that this birth is mysterious and unknown, just like getting in the car is mysterious and unknown. So yeah, like I said, there's probably so many layers of this that we could go on about, but just wanted that those are the things that were sort of at the forefront of my mind, and yeah, look forward to hearing everyone else's experience. So thanks.
Yeah, I love what you said. I mean, there's so many great points that I heard in your talk, in your introduction. Thank you so much for being with us. And you didn't duplicate. Actually, it was so much fresh and new as well. There's so many different parts of this story. But I was really struck by a couple things. Again, that biological intrinsic need to know the body of the baby. Mm-hmm. I love you saying that again. I think that is so missed in our culture. And then, you know, the other piece is this safety piece that you brought up. And safety is such a buzzword in our birthing community right now, because we have this mandate to make birth safer, and it almost ignores the reality that nothing we do is 100% safe. I mean, you said getting into the car, right? And yet people are numb to that idea. We are not always walking around with this clear realization that nothing we do is safe. I think it was Harriet Hartigan, who was one of the original birth photographers, and she's quoted as saying, "Birth is as safe as life gets," right? And I don't know if that's true or not, but I always love that saying, because it just, you know, as worried as you are about birth, like, you also drive around in a tin can time machine. You know, like, there's so many things that can go wrong every day, all the time. And so to bring some reality, some perspective into this conversation around perinatal loss is really refreshing. Thank you. And also the idea that we can't make birth 100% safe. That's a presupposition that we're missing in our conversations. And so, you know, to really grok that, I think, really shifts the conversation around perinatal loss, and perinatal loss out of the hospital specifically. You know, I think it's a statistical reality that if you practice long enough, you will be a part of a perinatal loss. And yeah, I think understanding and recognizing that is one huge hurdle in terms of processing this reality. I also wanted to say your comment about the family being your touch point or your grace. You know, I have to say, you know, I have gotten the experience to work with Jennifer, who's here on the call, through all 3 of her pregnancies in some capacity or the other. And I have to say that Jennifer and her husband's and extended family's grace in processing this experience is certainly one of my most powerful teachers. You know, witnessing her process, that has definitely been some of the most profound experience for me. And so I love that you said that too, because as odd as it seems, actually we can support each other if we have the same perspective of the fact that we're all doing the best we can and that birth isn't 100% safe. So that's a big part of the conversation. So thank you all for being here and for discussing this. I kind of have a question I'd like to open up to the midwives and sort of get your perspective. I guess the first one I want to say is, what does the midwife need in those moments right after the experience? Because obviously, if it's perinatal loss, you know, at the birth, or discovered at the prenatal, or if we're doing a postpartum visit, and the loss occurs, which is unfortunately the experience that happened in my practice. Obviously, the midwife is going to be so completely engaged in her skill, in offering her clinical skill, that she's not in her emotional body. And we're either successful or not at offering our clinical skill and affecting transport or calling in the people that are needed or what have you. But then there's an aftermath, right? After the ordeal, what does the midwife immediately need? And how can we translate that into a mechanism within the midwifery community so that we meet those most critical needs right away?
So I think that it's important to remember that as midwives, our need is somewhat met by our care, right? It's in our nature to require that the women in our care are taken care of. So sometimes it occurs to me that our first need is to ensure that the women in our care who have also experienced this loss are cared for by someone that we trust, that are taken care of, because we will not disengage. We will not go to a healing place unless we are absolutely certain that the woman that we were caring for is being cared for, right? So, and I think that's equally as important to the mother, right? But I think that sometimes what occurs is this shift has to happen so that the midwife can care for herself and the client can get lost. And then later the midwife, you know, you end up with this back and forth. So if the midwife has a community, I like to say village, if the midwife has a village, then she can affect a caring scenario that cares for the mother while she cares for herself. So in all of these, you know, scenarios, but particularly in Kea, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay. In Kaya's scenario, you know, perhaps somebody felt guilt or but Kaya felt the effect of the midwife's inability to engage and continue care. If perhaps that midwife did not have the support that she needed to continue to provide the care and then to take care of herself in a way that she could be present, understand her role, and so on. So for me, that feels like the first step. The first step is building the foundation so that we can support mothers even when we can't be fully present, when we have to take care of ourselves, because experiencing death in any capacity is striking, but to experience it in our own hands and with women that we've cared for, that we've loved and nurtured and placed hands on, it's breathtaking. So we have to find a way to build that village so that we are able to continue to care for that mother and then care for ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo that for sure. I think for me, what comes up is someone or like for the midwife specifically, because you covered so nicely with the client, someone to help answer the why. You know, why is it with my steady hands, my tools, you know, my trust, you know, that this still is this outcome, and that why being answered, you know, maybe is just not possible for whatever reason. You know, maybe there wasn't an autopsy done, like in my case, so I don't really know. Was there some sort of heart, you know, defect, and we'll never know, and you know, things of that nature where you can't really get this clinical sort of explanation from any one entity. You know, but then the other layers that we know that we're all functioning in, you know, the things that aren't tangible, right? Like the abstract pieces, you know, who can step in that sort of realm and say, you know, the why might be because you were ready to have this experience, or, you know, it's to help you be a more skilled midwife, or, I mean, just some sort of reassurance that, you know, you don't have that weight that we already know we carry of like, my God, what could I have done? What did I miss? How did I not know this? Or, you know, what was it that I could have done differently? You know, that's that piece to, you know, help us kind of get through from all these different aspects of that experience for you know, to just make a really holistic plan of, okay, you know, seek this sort of practitioner or this kind of therapist, or, you know, make sure that you speak to these sort of group of midwives who like this, like group, which is wonderful. You know, I feel like any midwife experiencing a sort of, you know, case like this should have and be sitting amongst midwives who have walked through the experience, and that can come from a place of compassion rather than judgment. Or, you know, and not that there's not always something to be learned, but I think when we are in such a delicate state and we've given all our reserves to the family, the last thing that we need in that moment is criticism. And we really need to be held. And I forget who mentioned it. I think it was Augustine, that, yeah, it's cold right now for the most part. I mean, like I said, I feel fortunate that I've had some midwives up here that I barely know that have been really tender. But in general, there are no circles, at least in my area, of midwives who are just getting together to talk about some tough births. It's usually in a very structured, cold peer review. Okay, let's get this done. Let's document everything. I need to get on with my day. And, you know, that where is the soul? You know, we're already against the grain as a home birth midwife. You know, we're already exhausted from just fighting so hard for this work that we do and to change this world, right? And yet in our own circle, you know, we're seeing ourselves in this room when we're peer reviewing or when we're gathering to try to make a change for licensure, but yet you know, where is the really truly where is the sisterhood? And especially in these times where we are doing this really, really hard work that no one wants to see this happen, right? And we're all supposed to be really gray and white when these kind of things happen, right? We're supposed to have like been doing this for 50 years or something, and that's when we have this.
How many CPMs I've heard that experienced it at their first birth. I've heard it so many times, and it's so disorienting, right? It doesn't fit into, like, if you trust birth, right? It blows it out of the water. So yeah, thank you for all of that. Anyone else? Let's hear who else. What other ideas? What does the midwife need?
So I really liked what Krista had to say about the care we provide. What really helped me in the immediate time after was seeing my client and sitting back in her living room with her. So I could then, like, in that moment, I was able to sort out feelings. And this is what I was carrying based on my assumptions of what she was feeling. And just to sit with her in her living room was so powerful, to say, okay, this heaviness doesn't really belong to me. And to, like, kind of put the grief in the appropriate places by being able to sit with my families and provide that care. You know, transformative in that moment, you know, that I can call to my mind exactly what it looked like, exactly what it felt like when I sat back in her living room and we brought, like, a gift to her older son, and he's playing on my lap, and, you know, she's just talking this beautiful story and not like this racked, you know, sobbing that I had expected, you know. And it was really so powerful in my own grief to assign, you know, to take some of the stuff that I was carrying that didn't actually belong to me.
Oh, that's so well said. Thank you.
I think also that we need to build some ceremony around midwives. You know, women used to come, they used to be surrounded, you know, by women, and at difficult times we took each other in, we surrounded each other, you know, we carried each other, and we're not doing that in our midwifery community, and particularly in these difficult times of need. You know, so-and-so had a birth, and did you hear about this? And then everybody is talking about it, and nobody is talking to it. And, you know, putting some ceremony behind that and some reverence behind that, I think, is really important, to start to build that. So it doesn't exist today. And, you know, like Val said, there is no village. There is, you know, people are meeting for peer review, and it's structured, but to put some reverence back in what we do, and to put some focus and some importance into that area, because we will all need it at one point. It's almost a function of future self-care to think about, you know, we need to start building this as a function of our future self-care. We need to start building these communities that are warm and nurturing and caring, because whether you suffer a loss or you come across a difficult situation, we are all continuously taking some sort of load that we then add and add and add. And how does that affect us long term?
Yeah.
Hi, could I say something?
Please.
I'm kind of being a mama fly on the wall listening to the midwives now. And it's just so fascinating and wonderful for me to be able to hear how thoughtfully you're all engaging this. And obviously this, you know, the fact that, you know, who's caring for the caregivers. And it's something I've encountered before, because I've spoken about my experience in other situations. And I think one thing that's so wonderful about midwives is their recognition that you yourself you're not an automaton. You know, you are a person with emotion and with a connection to this whole process that is very deep and often very spiritual. But I have two reactions listening to this. One is the beautiful recognition that someone has to care for the caregivers. But also at the same time, a little bit of ambivalence when I hear about the beautiful stories some of you have told about how you've received nourishment from the grieving family themselves. And of course, receiving that nourishment, of course, is wonderful, and we all need that. But I would be a little bit anxious to almost, I want to think that if that comes to you, how lovely, how wonderful. But I would be a little anxious if that sets anybody off hoping to get that. Because there I do have to, and I know that you all know that because you've all said this as well, that it is our grief. Of course, it can't be our job to be the ones to comfort you. Sometimes things work in that sort of beautiful mutual way, but not always. Sometimes because there might be issues of genuine issues of distrust, or just different styles of grieving, different places in the grieving process. So like I say, for me, it was very important that my midwife managed to communicate to me that she was available. If she could be helpful to me in any way, emotionally or professionally, but that she was getting her self-care elsewhere, and that she wasn't going to in any way ask for me to help her with that. That was her job separate from me. And for me, that was very important, that was clear to me, that I knew that she was going to need help processing, and I also knew that she wasn't going to look to me for that, even though we were the only ones that had been through this really together, and my partner. That was it. The doula showed up late. That was it. There was the three of us in the room. The other thing that I wanted to say in listening to this really nice conversation is the kind of two things that are always in the air. And one is the issue of blame. And the other is this recognition that nothing about life is 100% guaranteed. There's danger in everything. There's danger stepping into your car. And I've thought about this so much because what I found as part of my grieving process is that I would get angry either way. When people would start saying or suggesting it was because you had a home birth, I would be angry. And when people turned around and said, you know, there's no guarantees, you know, there's probably nothing you could have done, I got angry. And I thought they were saying, don't worry your pretty little head about it. I thought people were trying to shut me off from difficult thoughts. And one thing that I value so much about the natural birth community is this sort of commitment to radical honesty. At least that's the way I think of it, radical honesty. And that means, on the one hand, being able to live with and be present for the hard stuff, but also not, even in the need for self-care and in the need for recovery and healing, not to say, maybe it's because I'm a history professor and I like evidence and I like doing research. I don't want to hear the words, there's nothing you could have done about it, or birth, you know, all of life is dangerous. I don't want to hear those words until you've investigated my particular case. Because the reality is, and this is true in midwifery, it's true in mainstream medical practice, sometimes people do make mistakes that could have been avoided. Sometimes people commit malpractice. I don't want my tragedy to be swept under the rug by, okay, this is going to sound hopelessly direct, but I don't want my tragedy swept under the rug by somebody saying it's risky to get into your car too. Okay, I want to know that the people who I was entrusting my life and my baby's life with, I want to know that they're thinking the hard thoughts, and that they're also doing that in a way that's honest about the emotional toll that very process can take. So then you do need to get care for walking through that process. But like I say, I think that all of this is rooted in such a commitment to radical honesty, that we place such high expectations on ourselves, both as clients and as midwives and as doulas and as caregivers of all kinds, as parents, that part of that responsibility, but also what part of what makes it meaningful is that we really walk all the way, that we don't try to cut it short, we don't try to cut aspects of it short, and that we do get the care we need along the way. So those are some of my thoughts listening to the conversation.
If I may as well kind of add to that. I never, no, I mean, that's not right. I did blame my midwife for the mistake she made. Because of the mistake she made, I got really sick. She never owned to those mistakes. She never said to me, I'm sorry. Her reaction was very different. This at the same time in Hawaii, it's just the culture here. It's really different. This particular midwife carries a lot on her shoulders. She was training about 20 of us. She has a lot of love for the Hawaiian culture. There are currently no Hawaiian midwives at least on the island of Oahu, where I'm from. And that was something she was passionate about, training Hawaiian midwives. She wasn't going to charge me for her services. She had a lot of love, but when this happened, it was a flip, like a switch. A very defensive wall came up. And listening to you, all of you, I really appreciate so much your honesty and sharing your stories, where you came from, that the births that you've had on the other side. I'm seeing the other side of this, and I really appreciate that insight. That I don't think she does have that support. You're right. She's what's considered a traditional midwife. We have maybe one or like two or three very popular midwives on Oahu, and she's one of them, and her method is very traditional. And when this happened, I really felt let go. She kept trying to get in touch with me and get a hold of me, and but initially when she came at like a very defensive way, it was really hard for my fiance to take. He didn't know what to he didn't know how to take this. He didn't know. He told me straight up that he blames, and like, again, the word blame, but I mean, this was when he was very emotional, and he said that he trusted the world of home birthing, and that he had trusted me in bringing him into this world, and he was fine with it until it went wrong. But again, nothing caused baby's demise. It was just, I was really surprised at the way things unfolded with my particular midwife, and I was heartbroken. It was a loss of a relationship. It was a loss of a mentorship. I loved this woman, and I revered her. I was training under her, and so when this happened, for the hands to go up and be like, I'm not gonna take ownership of this, was devastating to me. It was really hard for me to deal with that, to deal with her not really wanting to take ownership that she made a mistake. And so the stories, the gossip, I hear it all the time. People always blame baby's demise on, oh, you had a home birth. It's because you're afraid of the doctors. And I heard it all. So it's, it's safe to say that I forwarded in my grief, just kind of shouldering these things and not really dealing with it. And I haven't really dealt with my relationship with my midwife, and she has reached out to me again. She's also a lot older. She's in her 70s, and she's been doing this for a really long time. I've been with her on at least 2 births. I've witnessed her, and she's an incredible, loving, very gifted midwife. It's just, I don't know personally how to move forward in rebuilding that relationship if it needs to be rebuilt. And, I mean, I don't see any of you saying, oh, I not owning up to any mistakes that might happen, but mistakes do happen, and I don't want blood in return. I don't know how to explain. Like, it just was really hurtful that wasn't acknowledged.
Yeah. Yeah, you bring up such an important point, and this obviously goes to the entire midwife client relationship throughout the course of their entire care, is really taking responsibility for that which is ours to take responsibility of. And there's certain things that mom does or doesn't do in her pregnancy, labor, and birth, and there's certain things that the midwife should or shouldn't do. And really getting clear on those boundaries can change the relationship significantly. One of the things I counsel for midwives in practice is about how to be clear on boundaries. And it's not just so that we midwives have a better quality of life or what have you. It's actually so that the client can have a better understanding of what her responsibility is, and also to know what to rely on you for. It's a very important part of the midwifery process, boundary setting, and being clear about our limits. And so as it applies to perinatal loss, being clear about which mamas and babies are low risk, so that we know which ones are appropriate for our care in out-of-hospital birth. And so that could be, a year-long workshop in itself. We won't be covering that tonight. But obviously, one of the main takeaways here is proper risk assessment and proper referral for next-level care. And like I said, that's a whole nother workshop. I'd love to ask another question to the whole group, and that is, how is midwifery as a profession going to transcend this history of silence and shaming and blaming as it relates to being a part of a perinatal demise? How are we going to transcend this? And so we've heard from the mamas about their experience with their various midwives and the process. We've heard from the midwives and their experience with the mamas at their births. And from all the talking points, I'd love to kind of create a brainstormed list of how we as a community in this culture, in this country, transcend this history of silence, of shame, of blame, and really come to somebody said a soft landing place. I think that was Krista, or Tara maybe, a soft landing place. Without obviously, not immediately, obviously. Immediately we're doing our clinical work, but in the aftermath, in the recovery, what creates a soft landing place? What are those resources? How can we rely on it? How do we start to break down this history or her story of shame and blame and silence?
So I think that one of the first places that we have to start with is, number one, hearing more from the mothers, hearing more from the midwives, more opportunities to hear out. Nobody is going to understand the importance of this if it stays underground. Hearing stories like Kaya's makes me instantly think we need to start building building scenarios where if a midwife doesn't if she's not there for her client, that other midwives in her community are. That if a midwife feels responsible, that she has someone to talk to about how to communicate that to her client. That if, you know, that there's these processes in place, that we start to build processes and structure around how we take something that we hold so dear to us and that can be very scary, and we start outlining those on a more national level. Even how do we nationally as a community serve? It all comes back to the mothers. I mean, you know, and it can sound like we're saying, you know, one thing or another, but really it comes down to how is that structure helping us better serve our clients, which will then allow us to better serve ourselves, which will then build better community. You know, how do we do that? And there has to be processes. And some midwives, and as Jennifer can attest to, some midwives have built that into their practice. They have a process, they know what they need to do, and it's all spelled out. But as a healthcare practice nationwide, we don't have that, and we don't have that in place so that we can better serve these women and better heal ourselves, right?
Well, exactly, and so this perfectly segues to my real desire for tonight. Is I would like to sort of plant the seeds for the development of a national nonprofit advocacy group that creates some of that soft landing. And the aim is midwives, but perhaps the scope will grow for home birth mamas as well. There are quite a lot of resources for mamas, but we really don't have them for midwives. And if you do get counseling, it's fairly generic grief counseling. It doesn't really have anything to do with the political landmine that most midwives find themselves in. And so my hope is that this can be the beginning of a real actionable step. And I wonder what you all have to say.
Augustine, do you mind if I go next? I think especially because of where I am in Pennsylvania, and like I said, there's huge lack of community. There's a lack of support in almost the entire state, but especially where I am. I think something like, I'm sure all of you are familiar with Karen Strange and how she offers people to call her after they have had a resus and to kind of debrief. And I think just that phone conversation where you kind of tell the story of what happened and get feedback. And if there was something like that where we could call in or video chat or, you know, something like that, it would definitely benefit people like me where we don't have the local support.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, I offer that in the country, and quite a few midwives do take advantage of it. I don't offer that as a community service. It is part of my my business. But what I'm thinking about here is some kind of very specific to perinatal loss. Maybe it would be a membership, maybe it would be a publication, maybe it would be a website resource, maybe it would be an on-call phone number that rotated volunteers, some way that we could get the word out so that when a midwife experiences this, and the reality is it's not going away, right? Death is a part of life. When a midwife experiences this, and home birth numbers are on the rise, right? So this is a reality. She would know exactly who to call, and not potentially hostile community members, not members of her community that are a part of her investigative board that are going to need to hear her actual testimony, but non-biased, confidential resource, so that there's a soft landing. And this is kind of my vision on a national scale. I wonder if it's possible. I don't know. Still percolating.
Augustine.
Yeah.
One of the things, this is Jen, sorry.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've really learned through the grief process is that grief is, I mean, everybody talks about how it's cyclical and how it all comes in waves and things like that. And you learn how to kind of cope, but you also find healing in a lot of things. And one thing that I've really enjoyed out of this conference is kind of hearing the opposite side of it, hearing the midwife's perspective and hearing how midwives that have been through this, either through a stillbirth or through a perinatal loss, how they've kind of found coping. And one of the things that I applauded so much to the practice that you used to have was that how all of the midwives really did come together as a community. And so knowing that other midwives in other areas don't have that, I couldn't even imagine. I mean, I know when we had our service for my son, for Jude, I mean, I'd say at least 3/4, if not more, of the midwife practice showed up. And they were there definitely for me, but they were there for each other too. And I'm so thankful that there was that support on both sides, you know. It was there for my husband and I and our families, but it was also there for my midwife. You know, it was there. Augustine, you were there so much for her. I mean, probably 100% more than I will ever know, probably. But I think that this is, I mean, such a noble cause and such an important thing for every midwife to have to need and to, I don't know, I'm glad that I was able to be a part of this call, and I'm glad that I'm able to know that you're trying to forefront, you know, training like this and education to help others and such. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anyway.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I'm a connector. That's like my life's purpose. And so, you know, I'm doing that here, but so many midwives don't have that experience. I had a call a couple of weeks ago from a midwife who had just a really severe outcome that involved, you know, several admissions and lots of medicine, and the reaction in her community was instantly of blame, not only from the physicians who received the transport, but from her own sister midwives, who automatically assumed that she must have been lacking, and her lack of skill must have been the reason for this outcome. And in reviewing the case with her, and you know, when I do, you know, paid consulting, I review the whole chart with them confidentially. I was shocked to see that in fact, no, she had done everything exactly in order, exactly what is the standard of care, what is expected, what I absolutely evaluate is the appropriate course of action. And still, you know, we have bad outcomes. We're not actually in charge. We can't control this process in labor any more than we can in life, right? Did you expect to be exactly here 5 years ago? You know, life is funny that way. And it is shocking to me how much we lack in the midwifery culture. I mean, it tells you how incredibly adaptive we are, how much we're getting done. But at this point, we seem to be growing exponentially without a strong infrastructure. And so this idea I have, and this connection we have all brought together is a part of that. Like that's the hope, is that we can help to create some of the infrastructure, some of the foundation, so that when we have foundation shaking, rocking events, there's a strong base there to support us. So I wonder what else we can do. Anyone else have ideas?
Augustine, I really appreciate your big picture vision for what we can do going forward. But, you know, just thinking about myself personally, like, how am I going to react when I hear another member of my community experiences a loss? You know, am I going to be guilty of the same sort of behavior that I'm that I've experienced from my community, you know, so I have to really, you know, just be brutally honest with myself about this and like, what type of connector am I in my community? You know, do I work to build these connections, not just in regards to loss, but like in the day-to-day practice, you know, in the day-to-day clientele. There's a lot of us in this area, so it sometimes feels like we're operating from scarcity. And I think that keeps people really guarded in the community when we feel like there's such a small pool of clients and there's all of these midwives. It makes connection very difficult because we feel like we're against each other. So I really, you know, this call has given me some motivation to kind of check myself in these situations, like how am I acting in community with my other midwives and how can I change that? Personally, you know, and I can't be responsible for how it's received or how anybody else does it, but you know, that's the stuff I have to take those really long, hard looks at myself too.
Well, and thanks for that radical honesty. And I think we are calling that of all of us. And one sort of distinction in thought process that really sort of came to me about 10 years ago, and I've been practicing for about 18 years now, is this this complete and utter commitment to believing the innocence, to believing that everyone is doing the best they can. Like this complete and utter belief in my sister midwives. And, you know, when you know, we're women, we're really strong alpha women. We all have really amazing opinions. And it's kind of a challenge, right? I mean, midwifery is like, woo. And so it's been an ongoing practice. But when I fully made that switch in myself to being like, I believe that this midwife is doing everything that she can, that she's very well trained, that she's totally shown up for this woman. I believe in her innocence, so to speak, when we're coming from that blame shame place. It allows me to be fully present. It allows me to believe what's possible. And then when I am evaluating it, either in peer review or in consulting, or, you know, when I used to run a big birth center practice with, you know, all the midwives that worked under me, when I was hearing their reviews or hearing their calls, it was about really, truly investigating what happened. So in other words, I come from this place of like deep wonder. And I hear that's what you're saying, Christy, is like really choosing that in yourself to believe the good. And of course, that's a life journey process. But it will make a difference. And this, the other side of that I want to really also bring up, the other side of that is that there are many, many, many midwives in this culture, in this country, who do not have enough education. And NARM and MEEK and US MERA are trying to approach that with various, you know, bridge program and CEU programs. And, you know, the ICM came out with their guidelines of what a midwife is, and we're trying to catch up. But I would say there are a lot of midwives who are practicing that have incomplete knowledge in a lot of the clinical care. And so right along with believing the positive and believing the innocence comes the charge that we have as a community to further the information and education of our colleagues. And the balance between those two is to speak radical truth, to call out the mistakes. And not in a blame and shame way, but in a really honest, clear teaching way. When you hear something happening in your community that doesn't seem appropriate, going to the source, asking questions from wonder, and then speaking your truth. It's sort of a recipe that I feel like could change the cultural perceptions, or change the conversation.
And I think to further that, we need to challenge ourselves to not just believe that everyone has a good, purpose, and but to understand when the skill did not meet the situation, when there was responsibility to be had, and to walk beside that midwife.
Yes.
And help her rather than abandon her.
Yes.
Because I think that that's, why we end up with a scenario where, potentially someone like Kea is left to feel like she has been abandoned and nobody took responsibility. Potentially nobody walked with that woman and helped her get to the point that would allow her to understand what had fully happened, understand it clinically, really work through it all, and then and then determine what the next step was. If you have nobody to do that with, you're left defensive and closed.
Yes.
And, we really have to. And I urge people like Lisa and Jennifer and Kea to continue to talk to midwives, because I think that you make a huge difference in what we intend to do and how we intend to treat our communities and the processes we intend to develop. Because knowing that these stories exist, knowing that, I know Lisa left, but knowing that she was left to feel like an entire community knew her story, but nobody reached out to her, just tells me we can drop flowers, we can leave notes on a door. We don't have to, break confidentiality. There's things that we can do as human beings. Mm-hmm. And, it tells me that Kea needs somebody to take responsibility or to walk through that birth and to clinically, review it and say, that here's what occurred and here's who and what and when, and you didn't deserve this.
Yeah.
So I hope that, that both mothers and midwives will continue to hear each other in this fashion, because I think that it is so critically important that we don't turn away from where there is a lack, where there is a need, and we can walk with that and we can help bridge that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is the first start of that conversation. And so as we're winding up here, I just want to say, just like from the bottom of my heart, thank you to each of you for showing up in your vulnerability and your honesty and sharing your heart with us today. And I'd also, ask that if you're willing to participate in this actionable steps of creating community, safe, loving community for women midwives who are walking this path. If you'd like to walk with them, either as part of this panel, or if you're watching this, if you'd like to be a part of reshaping the conversation, please be in touch with me or Krista, and let's sort of see what can come out of this. As we close up tonight and each of you says good night, if there's anything that you haven't shared that you'd really like to, please do.
I just wanted to say really quickly with respect to walking with this family that I got really great feedback in being able to listen to the family tell their labor and birth story, and encourage them to share as many times as they wanted. And I always called the child by name, and really got, again, just great response in that way, that we feel like we can only say his name to you because you were here, or we feel like we can't say his name to anyone else because they don't understand, or they weren't there with us, and it's like he's not real. But I think speaking the child's name, because the child is real and the child will always be with the family, at least is a big takeaway for me as I humbly with them, and I'm always learning and I'm always growing and feeling so gracious that that as terrible and sad as it is, I'm learning, forbid, if I had to ever walk through it again, but also to help my sister midwives, if they in fact find themselves, walking this path at some point, that, hey, here are some, ways that I helped or got feedback that would be better for me to help if I did this, to just essentially keep the woman at the center as always, and taking, those really positive parts of these experiences to help mold and shape, what can be the best way for us to support families and also support ourselves as a community. And yeah, it's just something that had popped into my head that I feel like is really, has really been helpful and important.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Augustine, to touch on what Val was just saying, you mentioned that how about going forward with this. I think one of the things that would be probably helpful to maybe any birth participant is creating some sort of a website. I don't know if that's something that people could get together and put together documents or paperwork or whatever, but that has this kind of information. It's not just from a basic perspective, checking back with not only the care providers, but also the individuals, and just with some of this stuff, because when my first close friend that lost a baby after me, it was a whole different experience, because people leaned on me to be like, to wonder what and how to act. And, when I started researching, like, just in those moments, like, how can I help this mom? How can I help the people that have been involved? There's so little information. And the information that, even just that's been shared on this, it's like 100 times what's out there.
Yeah.
I don't know if in the future you plan to try to put together, even if it's just a basic website with just some links of here's places to look or ideas. I feel like that would be really helpful for the midwives to have and to have access to, but also for just general people to have.
Yeah.
So that's just a thought.
Thank you. And thanks for being on the call. I hear your sweet children. Will you give your whole family my love?
I will definitely do that. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to close tonight? Okay. Well, if there aren't any more closing statements, I want to thank you all so much. Tonight has been so meaningful for me. I know it will be for the midwives who get to participate via watching. And I hope that we can collaborate again in the future. And thank you, thank you, thank you.